Poor mom with baby helps billionaire's autistic daughter put ornaments on the Christmas tree, and what he does next is unbelievable. The freezing wind cut across Katie's face as she walked down the empty street. Sophie slept in the sling tied to her chest, protected from the cold by the only blanket they had. It was Christmas Eve, and house lights twinkled in every window. Families gathered, laughter, warmth. Katie was 27 and had been living on the streets for 3 months. She hugged Sophie tighter against her chest and kept walking. Her feet ached inside her torn sneakers. Hunger had been gnawing at her for hours, but she had managed to get some milk for the baby earlier. That was what mattered. Katie stopped in front of a huge mansion. The iron gates were tall, and the garden looked like something out of a movie. Decorated trees, golden lights everywhere, a fountain in the center. She stood there, just looking, not with envy, just with exhaustion. That's when she saw the girl. A little blonde girl was alone in the front yard, near an enormous pine tree. She was about 6, with golden hair to her shoulders and light eyes that sparkled under the lights. She wore a red velvet dress, but her face was tense, frustrated. The girl was holding a box of ornaments that seemed too heavy for her. She tried to place the box on the ground, but it toppled over, and several decorations rolled across the lawn. Silver balls, golden ones, little stars, red bows. The little girl stood still, staring at the mess. Her hands started to tremble. She knelt down and picked up a silver ball. She stood up, went to the tree, and tried to hang it on a branch. But the ornament hook wouldn't fit properly. She tried again, and again the ball fell off. The girl took a deep breath, picked up the ornament from the ground, and tried once more. Her hands were trembling more now. The ornament slipped from her fingers and rolled away. Katie watched the frustration build on the child's face. The little girl picked up another ornament, this time a golden star. She stretched her arm out, trying to reach a higher branch. She stood on her tiptoes, but she was too small. She stretched further, almost reached it. The star fell. The girl let out a low sound of frustration. She covered her ears with her hands and began to rock her body back and forth. Her eyes were squeezed shut. Katie knew that sign. She looked around. No one. The mansion was silent. Just the little girl and the enormous tree that seemed impossible to decorate alone. Katie didn't think twice. She pushed the gate, which was ajar, and entered the garden. The girl was facing away, breathing fast, still rocking. She hadn't noticed Katie approaching. "Hi," Katie said, her voice calm and soft. The little girl turned quickly, her eyes wide, frightened. She took a step back. Katie stopped where she was and smiled. "It's okay. I just came to see if you needed some help." The girl looked at Katie, then at Sophie, who was waking up in the sling. The baby had light blonde hair and curious blue eyes. Katie pointed at the tree. "I'll help you, sweetie." The little girl hesitated. She looked at the ornaments scattered on the ground, at the still bare tree, and back at Katie. "Thank you very much," she whispered, so softly that Katie barely heard her. Katie knelt down and began picking up the ornaments from the ground, putting them back in the box. The girl stood still for a moment, just watching. Then, slowly, she knelt down too and started to help. "Kai, which one do you want to put up first?" Katie asked, showing a golden ball. The girl pointed to a silver star. "Good choice. Let's go." Katie took the star and stood up. The girl stood beside her, watching. Katie hung the ornament on a branch at the right height and took a step back. "Look how beautiful it looks." The little girl tilted her head, studying it. A small smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. Katie picked up another ball, this time red, and handed it to the girl. "Want to try putting this one up?" The girl took the ornament carefully. She looked at the tree, chose a low branch, and hung it. It worked. The ornament swayed gently. The little girl's eyes lit up. "Perfect," said Katie. "You're great at this," they continued. Katie took the bigger ornaments and helped the girl choose where to put them. The little girl grew more confident. She started picking up the decorations herself, choosing the colors, deciding the spots. When she needed to reach the higher branches, the girl pointed and Katie placed it, but the rest she did herself. "This golden ball here?" the girl asked, showing a large ornament. "Perfect. It will go nicely with that silver one next to it." The little girl hung it carefully and took a step back to look. She smiled. Sophie began to stir in the sling, and Katie quickly untied it to adjust her better. The baby was fully awake and looked at everything with curious eyes. The little girl stopped decorating and approached. She looked at Sophie, fascinated. "She's small," the girl said. "She is. She's 10 months old. This is Sophie." The girl hesitantly reached out and touched the baby's chubby foot. Sophie kicked her legs and let out a little squeal of joy. The little girl giggled. It was a low sound, almost shy, but it was there. She touched Sophie's foot again, and the baby laughed too, waving her little arms. "She likes you," Katie said, smiling. The girl stayed there for another moment, playing with Sophie's tiny toes. Then she went back to the tree, more animated now. They worked together for the next few minutes. The tree took shape, gold and silver balls on the middle branches. Small stars scattered everywhere, red bows on the tips. Lights were already on the tree, and when the girl flipped the switch, everything sparkled. The little girl took a step back, her hands clasped in front of her chest. She looked at the tree, at the twinkling lights, at the gently swaying ornaments. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Katie stood next to the girl. "It's perfect. You did an amazing job." The girl looked at Katie and her smile widened. It was a huge smile, full of pure joy. "We did it together," the little girl said. Katie felt a pang in her chest. She nodded. "We certainly did." They stood there for a while longer, just looking at the illuminated tree. The girl couldn't stop smiling. She walked around the tree, looking at every ornament, every detail. "This one looks pretty," she said, pointing to a golden ball. "And this one too." Katie chuckled softly. "They all look beautiful." The little girl came back close to Katie and looked at Sophie, who was almost asleep again, snuggled against her. "Are you leaving now?" the girl asked, and her voice dropped lower. Katie felt her heart sink. She needed to go. The cold was increasing, and she still needed to find a place to spend the night with Sophie. "I have to go, sweetie." The girl lowered her head. Her fingers played with the hem of her red dress. Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked, almost whispering. Katie looked at that little blonde girl with the bright eyes, at the tree they had decorated together, at the smile that had been on her face. She knelt down in front of the little girl. "Yes, I will." The girl's face lit up. She didn't say anything, but her eyes shone in a way that melted Katie's heart. "I promise," the little girl whispered. "I promise." The girl smiled again. She took a step forward and suddenly hugged Katie. It was quick, but it was there. A tight, desperate hug. Katie hugged her back, carefully, protecting Sophie between them. When the girl stepped away, she waved shyly. Katie waved back and started walking toward the gate. Sophie was quiet now, almost asleep again. Katie looked back one last time. The little girl was standing next to the illuminated tree, waving. The lights sparkled around her, and the smile was still there. Katie went out the gate and back onto the cold street, but this time she was smiling too. For the first time in months, Katie felt good, useful, important. She had helped someone, and that girl had smiled because of her. Katie walked down the street with Sophie in her arms, and for the first time in a long time, she felt something like hope. She would come back tomorrow. She had promised. Jonathan parked the car in the garage and turned off the engine. It was almost 7 in the evening and he was exhausted. Meetings all day, non-stop calls, problems to solve. All he wanted was to go inside, see Zoe, and maybe get her to eat something for dinner. He sighed and got out of the car. The nanny had left earlier today. She had warned him she had a family commitment, and Jonathan had dismissed her. Zoe would be fine alone for a few hours. She always stayed in her room anyway, drawing or playing with her toys. Jonathan entered through the side door and took off his coat. The house was silent. Normal. Zoe didn't make noise. She was quiet. She always had been. He threw the keys onto the table and walked toward the stairs. "Daddy!" Jonathan stopped. He turned around, confused. Zoe was standing at the living room door, with a huge smile on her face. She was wearing the red dress he had bought for Christmas, and her eyes were shining in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. "Zoe," he said, still processing. Zoe never ran up to him when he arrived. She always waited quietly in her room until he came up to see her. And she never called him like that, so excited. "Come look," Zoe said, waving her hand. Jonathan stood still for a second, trying to figure out what was happening. Then he walked to the living room, following his daughter. Zoe practically bounced up to the window overlooking the front yard. She pointed outside. "Look, Daddy." The tree. Jonathan looked through the window. The Christmas tree in the garden was completely decorated. Twinkling lights, gold and silver ornaments, red bows, and a shining star on top. It was perfect. He blinked, confused. You decorated the tree." Zoe nodded, excited. "Katie helped me." Jonathan frowned. "Katie? Who is Katie?" Zoe smiled even wider. "A lady. She has a tiny baby, Sophie. Her little foot is so cute, Daddy." Jonathan knelt down in front of his daughter. He was trying to understand. "Zoe, a lady came here. Today." "Yes, she helped me with the tree. I couldn't get the ornaments on. But she helped me, and the tree looks beautiful." Jonathan felt a chill down his spine. A stranger had entered the property, had talked to Zoe. But before he could say anything, Zoe continued. "She was very nice to me, Daddy. And Sophie is so small. She has little blue eyes, and I touched her foot, and she laughed." Jonathan watched his daughter. Zoe was talking fast, excited, her hands gesturing. She wouldn't stop smiling. This was strange. Zoe almost never talked that much. She was quiet, answered in monosyllables, avoided eye contact, but now she was looking directly at him, telling him everything with excitement. "Zoe, this lady, did she tell you her name?" "Katie, and the baby is Sophie. Does she live around here?" Zoe shrugged. "I don't know. But she said she's coming back tomorrow." Jonathan felt a tightness in his chest. An unknown woman had appeared out of nowhere, interacted with his daughter, and now was coming back. He should be worried. He should be furious. But when he looked at Zoe, he saw something he hadn't seen in months. Joy. Zoe was genuinely happy. Her eyes were sparkling. Her smile was real, and she hadn't stopped talking since he arrived. "How long ago did she leave?" Jonathan asked. "A little while ago. She said she's coming back tomorrow. She promised, Daddy." Jonathan stood up and looked out the window again. The tree was truly beautiful, every ornament in the right place, the lights shining perfectly. Whoever this Katie was, she had accomplished something Jonathan had been trying to do for years. She had made Zoe smile. "Come see it up close, Daddy," Zoe said, pulling his hand. Jonathan let his daughter guide him to the front door. They went out into the garden and the cold night air hit his face. Zoe ran to the tree and Jonathan followed her. "Look," Zoe said, pointing to a golden ball. "I put that one up, and this star here too." She showed him every ornament, explaining where she had put it, which ones Katie had helped her hang. She couldn't stop talking. Jonathan stood there, listening. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions. He just watched his daughter, so alive, so present. "She's nice, Daddy," Zoe said, looking at him. "Katie is very nice." Jonathan nodded slowly. "She seems to be..." Zoe was silent for a moment, looking at the tree. Then she said, softly, "She's coming back tomorrow. She promised." Jonathan felt something churn inside him. Zoe was counting on it. She wanted this Katie to return. What if she didn't? What if it was just a fleeting moment? He didn't want to see his daughter disappointed, But at the same time, he couldn't deny what he was seeing. Zoe was different, more open, happier. "Okay," Jonathan said, putting his hand on his daughter's shoulder. "If she promised, then she'll be back." Zoe smiled and hugged his leg. It was quick, but it was there. A spontaneous hug. Jonathan froze. Zoe didn't do that. She didn't like physical touch, avoided hugs, got tense when someone got too close, but now she was hugging him, unforced, without hesitation. He placed his hand on her head, gently. "Shall we go inside? It's cold out here." Zoe let go of him and nodded. They went back inside, and Zoe went straight to the living room. She sat on the sofa, still smiling, and started swinging her legs. Jonathan stood in the doorway, just watching. Who was this Katie? He knew nothing about her. He didn't know where she had come from, why she had helped Zoe, or why she had promised to come back. But she had done something no one else had been able to. She had connected with Zoe. Jonathan looked at the tree through the window. It shone in the dark garden, perfect and full of life. He thought about his daughter, so excited, so unlike her usual self. And for the first time in a long time, Jonathan felt something like hope. Maybe this Katie, whoever she was, could be exactly what Zoe needed. He didn't know, but he would find out tomorrow. When she returned. If she returned. Katie walked 3 blocks until she reached the town square. Sophie was asleep again, nestled against her chest. Night had fallen completely and the cold was worse. She stopped near a grocery store. A few people went in and out with full shopping bags. Katie took a deep breath and positioned herself near the door. "Excuse me," she said to a man in a suit. "Do you have any change? I need to buy milk for my baby." The man didn't even look at her. He walked right past. Katie tried again. "Please, ma'am." "Just some change." The woman clutched her purse closer to her body and quickened her pace. Katie closed her eyes for a second. She hated doing this. She hated asking, but she had no choice. Sophie needed milk. "Miss." Katie opened her eyes. An elderly lady was standing in front of her, holding a shopping bag. "Here," the lady said, holding out some coins. "Thus, buy the little one her milk." Katie felt her eyes sting. "Thank you so much. Seriously, thank you very much." The lady smiled and went on her way. Katie counted the coins. It wasn't much, but it was enough to buy a small carton of milk, maybe 2 if she was lucky. She entered the supermarket and went straight to the milk section. She grabbed 2 small cartons and went to the checkout. The woman who served her looked at Katie suspiciously, but scanned the products and took the money without saying anything. Katie left the store with the cartons in her old backpack. At least Sophie wouldn't go hungry tonight. She walked to a bench in the square and sat down. Sophie started whimpering, and Katie knew what it was. Hunger. She took the bottle out of her backpack and opened one of the milk cartons. She poured the white liquid into the bottle and closed it. The milk was cold. Sophie wouldn't be able to drink it like that. Katie held the bottle between her hands and started rubbing, trying to warm it up. Her hands were trembling with cold, and she squeezed them tighter around the bottle, blowing on it lightly. It took a few minutes, but the milk became less cold. Katie shook the bottle and tested it on her wrist. It was lukewarm. Not ideal, but it would do. She untied the sling and adjusted Sophie onto her lap. The baby opened her blue eyes, still whimpering. Katie put the bottle in her mouth, and Sophie started sucking eagerly. "Slow down, honey, take it easy." Katie watched Sophie drink the milk. The baby's blonde hair was messy, her cheeks red from the cold, but she was eating. That was what mattered. When Sophie finished, Katie put the bottle back in her backpack. She looked around the square. It was empty. Only a few homeless people scattered on the benches. Katie's stomach rumbled. She hadn't eaten since the morning, and even then it was just a piece of stale bread someone had thrown away. She needed to eat something. She couldn't run out of energy, or she wouldn't be able to take care of Sophie. Katie put the baby back in the sling and stood up. She knew of a bakery a few streets away. Sometimes they threw away stale bread in the trash at the end of the day. She walked there, with Sophie sleeping heavily against her chest. When she arrived, the bakery was already closed. Katie went to the back, where the dumpsters were. There was a trash bag next to the dumpster. Katie carefully opened it and looked inside. Hard rolls, some pieces of dry cake, a tray of old savory snacks. She grabbed 2 rolls and a piece of cake. It wasn't moldy, it was edible. Katie put the food in her backpack and walked away before anyone saw. She hated this. She hated looking for food in the trash, but it was all they had. The cold was unbearable now. Katie needed to find a place to sleep, a covered place, protected from the wind. She walked 2 more streets until she reached a closed store. It had a large awning in front, and the space underneath was empty. Katie sat down on the ground and leaned against the wall. Sophie was warm against her chest, sleeping deeply. Katie took the blanket out of her backpack and covered the baby carefully, adjusting it so the cold wouldn't get through. She took one of the rolls and bit into it. It was hard, dry, difficult to chew, but it satisfied her hunger. Katie ate slowly, looking at the empty street. A few cars passed by, people returning home, to their families, to warmth. She finished the roll and put the rest of the food away. She needed to save it for tomorrow. Katie adjusted herself better, resting her head against the wall. Sophie was safe in her arms, protected from the cold by the blanket and Katie's body. She closed her eyes, but couldn't sleep. The ground was hard, the cold seeped through her clothes, and the wind blew under the awning. Katie hugged Sophie tighter and kissed the baby's blonde head. "It's going to be all right, my love," she whispered. "I promise." Meanwhile, miles away, Zoe was lying in the king-size bed in her room. The comforter was thick and warm, the pillows soft. The heater kept the room at a perfect temperature. She was wearing soft, comfortable flannel pajamas. The room was dark, but the hallway light entered through the slightly open door. Zoe was holding a teddy bear and looking at the ceiling. She was thinking about Katie, her smile, Sophie, so small and cute. She wished tomorrow would come soon. She wanted Katie to come back. Jonathan came into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. "Still awake, sweetie?" Zoe turned her head towards him and nodded. "I can't sleep." "Why?" "I'm thinking about Katie and Sophie." Jonathan ran his hand through his daughter's blonde hair. "They'll be back tomorrow. Do you think so?" "I think so." Zoe smiled. She hugged the teddy bear tighter and closed her eyes. Jonathan stayed there for a few more minutes until he was sure she was asleep. Then he got up, turned off the hallway light, and went to his own room. Zoe slept peacefully, warm and safe. Katie didn't sleep. She stayed awake all night, protecting Sophie from the cold, adjusting the blanket whenever the wind blew, kissing the baby's forehead to make sure she was all right. Her body ached, her stomach rumbled, her feet were numb from the cold. But Sophie was safe. She was warm, she was sleeping, and Katie would endure. She always did. When the sun began to rise, Katie finally closed her eyes for a few minutes. But she soon woke up again because Sophie had started crying. She grabbed the bottle, prepared the milk, and fed the baby. Then she cleaned Sophie with old wet wipes she had saved, changed her diaper and adjusted her clothes. Katie looked at the sky. The day was beginning. She had promised to return, and she was going to keep her promise. Katie arrived in front of the mansion around 10 in the morning. Sophie was awake in the sling, looking at everything with curiosity. Katie had washed her face in a public fountain and tried to tidy her hair, but she knew she looked tired. She hadn't slept well. Her body ached, but she had made a promise. Katie stopped in front of the gate and took a deep breath. Was the girl waiting? Did she really want Katie to come back? Before she could think any further, she heard a shout. "Katie!" Katie looked up and saw Zoe running across the garden. The little girl had a huge smile on her face, her blonde hair flying back. She was wearing a blue dress today, and her bright eyes were shining. Zoe reached the gate and pushed it open. She ran to Katie and hugged her around the waist, squeezing tightly. Katie was speechless for a second. Then she put her hand on the girl's head, returning the hug. "Hi, sweetie. You came back. You promised and you came back?" Katie smiled. "So of course, I came back." Zoe let go of Katie and looked at Sophie, who was staring at her with curious blue eyes. "Hi, Sophie," Zoe said, waving at the baby. Sophie gave a toothless grin, and Zoe giggled. "Daddy!" Zoe shouted, turning towards the house. "She's back! Katie's back!" Katie looked up and saw a man coming out the front door. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up. His hair was dark, and he had a serious expression on his face. Katie swallowed hard. This must be the girl's father. Jonathan walked towards them, observing Katie carefully. He didn't look angry, but he didn't look exactly happy either. "So you're Katie," he said, stopping a few feet away. Katie nodded. "Yes, sir." "Jonathan," he said, extending his hand. Katie shook his hand quickly. Jonathan's hand was warm and firm. Hers was cold and trembling. Jonathan looked at his daughter, who was clinging to Katie, smiling. He saw the way Zoe held Katie's hand, the way she looked at Sophie. Something in his expression changed. It became softer. "Zoe hasn't stopped talking about you since yesterday," Jonathan said. Katie smiled, embarrassed. "She helped me a lot with the tree," Zoe said. "And Sophie is so cute, Daddy." Jonathan looked at the baby in the sling. Sophie had light blonde hair, rosy cheeks, and huge blue eyes. She looked at Jonathan and gave a little smile. "She's beautiful," Jonathan said. Then he looked back at Katie. "Would you like to come in, have some coffee?" Katie hesitated. She didn't want to intrude, but Zoe was already pulling her hand. "Come on, Katie, come in." Katie let the girl guide her into the house. Jonathan followed them, observing everything in silence. They entered through the front door, and Katie was impressed. The house was enormous, high ceilings, expensive furniture, everything clean and organized. It smelled of fresh coffee. "Sit down," Jonathan said, pointing to the large sofa in the living room. Katie sat on the edge, still holding Sophie. Zoe sat next to her, close, as if afraid Katie would disappear. Jonathan went to the kitchen and returned with a cup of coffee and a plate of cookies. He placed them on the coffee table. "Make yourself comfortable." Katie looked at the coffee, and her stomach rumbled. She hadn't had real coffee in months. But she took the cup carefully, sipping slowly. It was hot, delicious. She almost sighed with relief. Jonathan sat in the armchair across from her and crossed his arms, watching. "Zoe told me you helped her with the tree." Katie nodded. "She was trying to do it alone. I just helped." "Do you live around here?" Jonathan asked, casually. Katie froze. She lowered her eyes to the coffee cup. Zoe was looking at her, waiting for the answer. Katie hesitated. She didn't want to lie, but she was also ashamed to tell the truth. Jonathan noticed. He leaned forward. "Katie, where do you live?" Katie squeezed the cup between her hands. She felt her eyes sting, but held back the tears. "We're living on the streets," she said softly. Silence fell in the room. Jonathan stayed still, processing. He looked at Katie, then at Sophie, and back at Katie. "On the streets," he repeated, as if he hadn't understood. Katie nodded, unable to look at him. "How long?" 3 months. Jonathan ran his hand over his face. He looked shocked, and also sad. "Do you have family? Anyone who can help?" Katie shook her head. "I don't have anyone. Just Sophie." Zoe, who had been silent until now, held Katie's hand tightly. Katie looked at her and saw tears in the girl's eyes. "You can't leave," Zoe said, her voice trembling. "You can't." Katie felt a tightness in her chest. She stroked the girl's blonde hair. "It's okay, sweetie." "No, it's not," Zoe said, louder now. "You can't live on the street." "You can't." Jonathan stood up and started pacing the room. He was thinking, processing. Katie could see his mind working. He stopped and looked at Katie. "Do you have experience with children?" Katie blinked, confused by the change of subject. I do. I used to work at a daycare before everything. And with autistic children. Katie hesitated. Not professionally, but I studied about it in college, education. Jonathan nodded as if making a decision. Zoe hardly ever interacts with anyone, he said, looking at his daughter. But with you, she smiles, she talks, she hugs. Zoe was still holding Katie's hand, squeezing tightly, as if afraid to lose her. Jonathan took a deep breath. I want to hire you as Zoe's nanny. Katie's eyes widened. What? You would take care of her during the day. I work a lot, and the nanny I have now, she doesn't connect with her. Not the way you connected. Katie didn't know what to say. She looked at Zoe, whose eyes were shining with hope. But I have nowhere to live, Katie said, her voice cracking. Jonathan took a step forward. You two can live here. Katie felt the tears spill over. She wiped them quickly, but it didn't help. They kept falling. Sir, Jonathan, call me Jonathan. Jonathan, I can't accept this. It's too much. You would be working, he said firmly. It's not charity, it's a job. You would take care of Zoe, and in return, you would have a place to live, food and a salary. Katie looked at Sophie, who was looking at her with those innocent blue eyes. She looked at Zoe, who continued to hold her hand, silently pleading for her to stay. Katie couldn't speak. The tears wouldn't stop falling. Please, Zoe said, softly. Stay with us. That broke Katie. She sobbed and covered her face with her free hand. Jonathan approached and knelt down in front of her. You don't have to decide now, but think about it. For you, for Sophie. Katie raised her face and looked at him. Jonathan's eyes were also shining, emotional. I accept, Katie said, her voice broken. I accept. Zoe let out a little squeal of joy and hugged Katie tightly. Sophie, in the middle of it all, started clapping her hands, laughing. Jonathan placed his hand on Katie's shoulder, squeezing lightly. Welcome, he said, his voice husky. Katie was crying non-stop now. She hugged Zoe back, kissed Sophie's head, and looked at Jonathan with gratitude. For the first time in months, Katie felt like everything was going to be okay. She had a roof over her head. She had food, she had a job, and most importantly, she had people who cared. Zoe wouldn't let go of Katie, and Katie didn't want her to. The three of them stayed there, hugging, while Jonathan watched with a small smile on his face. That house had been silent for so long, but now it was full of life, and it had all started with a Christmas tree. Before Katie arrived, Zoe's routine was always the same. She would wake up, eat breakfast alone in the kitchen while Jonathan got ready for work. Then she would go up to her room and stay there. The old nanny would knock on the door sometimes, offer lunch, try to talk. Zoe would answer in monosyllables and go back to her drawings. She spent hours drawing, always in her room, always alone. She drew trees, houses, animals, never people. And she never showed her drawings to anyone. When Jonathan arrived in the evening, she was in the same spot, sitting on the floor with colored pencils scattered around her, drawing in silence. She didn't like to be touched. She didn't like noise. She didn't like change. Her world was small, controlled, safe, but lonely. Jonathan knew this. He watched his daughter close herself off more and more, and he didn't know how to help. All the nannies he hired gave up after a few weeks. Zoe wouldn't interact, wouldn't respond, wouldn't open up, until Katie arrived. In the first week with Katie, things began to change. On the first day after Jonathan left for work, Katie stayed in the living room with Sophie. She had put the baby on the rug with some toys and was sitting beside her, playing with her. Zoe was in her room as usual. Katie didn't push. She left Zoe's bedroom door ajar and continued playing with Sophie, talking to the baby, laughing when Sophie tried to grab a rattle. After half an hour, Katie heard light footsteps in the hallway. She looked up and saw Zoe standing at the living room door, watching. The girl didn't come in, she just stood there watching Katie and Sophie play. Katie smiled at her, but didn't say anything. Didn't call her over, just kept playing. Zoe stayed there for a few minutes, then she went back to her room. But the next day, she came back. And this time she stayed longer. On the third day, Zoe entered the living room. Katie was singing a little song to Sophie, shaking a rattle. Zoe walked slowly to the rug and sat down at a distance, still observing. Katie continued singing, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Sophie clapped her hands, and Katie laughed. Zoe didn't say anything. She just watched. But she was there, out of her room, in the living room. Katie knew that was huge. On the fourth day, Zoe brought her colored pencils. She came into the living room, sat on the sofa, and started drawing. Katie was on the rug with Sophie, but she looked at Zoe and smiled. "That's great. What are you drawing?" Zoe didn't answer, but she also didn't run away. Katie went back to playing with Sophie, and Zoe continued drawing. The room was silent, but it was a comfortable silence. After a while, Zoe held up the drawing and looked at Katie. It was a Christmas tree, full of colorful ornaments. "That looks beautiful," Katie said. "Just like ours." Zoe smiled. A small smile, but it was there. In the second week, Zoe started following Katie around the house. Katie would go to the kitchen to prepare Sophie's bottle, and Zoe would follow. She didn't talk, didn't help. She just stood there watching. Katie explained what she was doing, even without knowing if Zoe was paying attention. "I'm going to warm up Sophie's milk. She likes it lukewarm." Zoe watched Katie test the temperature on her wrist, fill the bottle, close the cap. When Katie went to the living room, Zoe followed. When Katie went upstairs to change Sophie, Zoe went up too and stood at the bedroom door watching. Katie never told her to leave, never asked why she was following. She just kept doing what she needed to do, always explaining, always calmly. And Zoe kept following. It was in the third week that Zoe started to imitate. Katie was sitting on the rug, rocking Sophie, humming softly. Zoe was sitting on the sofa, drawing as always. Sophie started whimpering, and Katie took a cloth and carefully wiped the baby's mouth. "There you go, sweetheart. It's all right." Katie looked up and saw Zoe watching. The girl had stopped drawing and was looking at the scene intently. The next day, when Sophie whimpered, Zoe got up from the sofa and grabbed the cloth before Katie did. She held it out to Katie without saying anything. Katie took the cloth and smiled. "Thank you, Zoe. That's very thoughtful of you." Zoe went back to the sofa, but Katie saw the little smile on her face. From that day on, Zoe started to help. She brought the bottle when Katie asked. She brought the diaper. She held the rattle for Sophie. She was participating. In the fourth week, Zoe started playing on the rug. Katie was playing with Sophie, stacking colored blocks. The baby knocked them down, and Katie built them up again, laughing. Zoe was on the sofa, but her eyes were glued to the game. "Want to play with us?" Katie asked, casually. Zoe hesitated. She looked at the blocks, then at Sophie, then back at Katie. Katie didn't insist. She went back to stacking the blocks. A few minutes later, Zoe got off the sofa and sat on the floor, at a safe distance. She didn't touch the blocks, she just watched. But she was there, on the rug, close. The next day, she sat closer, and the day after that, she picked up a block. Katie didn't make a fuss. She just smiled and kept playing. Sophie clapped her hands when she saw Zoe with the block, and Zoe placed it on top of the tower Katie was building. The tower fell, and Sophie burst out laughing. Zoe laughed too. It was the first time Katie had heard Zoe truly laugh. A low, shy laugh, but real. In the fifth week, Zoe started approaching spontaneously. Katie was bottle-feeding Sophie on the sofa. Zoe was drawing on the rug. Suddenly, she got up and walked to Katie. She didn't say anything. She just sat down next to her, very close, and watched Sophie drink the milk. Katie didn't move, didn't speak. She just kept feeding the baby, letting Zoe stay there, close. After Sophie finished, Zoe reached out and touched the baby's foot, just like she had on the first day. Sophie kicked her legs and smiled. Zoe smiled back. "She likes you," Katie said softly. "I like her too," Zoe replied. It was the first time Zoe had said something without being asked. Katie felt a surge of emotion in her chest, but didn't show it. She just smiled and nodded.
If you want this type of stories, then subscribe to Golden Chapter Whispers.